She was 22 and penniless. No family left to take her in, no roof of her own, just a small carved beechwood bread peel worn warm by 4 generations of women's hands, a single thumbed page from her babka's hearth book sewn into the lining of her wool coat pocket, and 4 single-dollar bills she had earned scrubbing crocks at a small Polish bakery outside Pottsville. And with that $4, she bought a small brick-and-clay outdoor bread-bake oven built into the slope of the backyard of an abandoned coal miner's row house at the back end of Kowalski Row in the small anthracite coal patch village of Kowalski Hollow in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, in a stretch of the Schuylkill anthracite country that had not heard the slow scrape of a wooden bread peel across a hot brick hearth since the autumn of 1962. The brick crown of the oven had cracked along the second course. The hand-laid clay flue had silvered with frost and slumped. But what nobody knew, least of all Helena Kowalski herself, was that sealed in a hand-built brick vault behind the oven's inner fire-brick chamber, packed inside a hand-built cypress chest, was something her babka and her babka's babka had saved and set down there across 127 years that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if you love stories like these, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. She had seen the bake oven on a hand-printed card thumbtacked to the bulletin board of the small Schuylkill County Co-op in Mahanoy City, in soft pencil. Coal patch bake oven, quarter acre, backyard slope, $4 or best offer. See Mr. Stanislaw Wojcik at the courthouse. She had $6.40 folded in the inside pocket of her wool coat, the last of 3 weeks of bakery wages. She walked the half-mile down to the small Schuylkill County courthouse on a cool Tuesday morning in early October with the wild raspberry canes just beginning to turn deep red along the coal patch backyards, and she asked the woman at the front desk for Mr. Stanislaw Wojcik by name. Mr. Stanislaw Wojcik was 80 years old and had been the deputy clerk of Schuylkill County for 53 of those years. He looked up at her when she said her name and went very still. Kowalski, he said slowly, the Galician hill in the word. From Kowalski Hollow. You'd be Jadwiga's great-granddaughter then. Helena nodded once. He folded his hands and walked back into a small storeroom and came back with a heavy iron key on a piece of plain hemp twine. $4, he said. We have been keeping this key 63 years. Your babka left it with my father back in 1962, and she told him plain, hand this to whichever Kowalski girl walks back up the patch row asking after the oven. She paid him 4 soft paper dollars and signed her name. He walked her to the door and set his old hand for 1 second on her shoulder. You go on up there before the coal country dark sets in, hon, he said. The oven has been waiting on you a long while. She had grown up with the smell of wood smoke and rising rye, with the deep, warm, sweet smell of dark rye and buckwheat bread coming out of a hot brick hearth oven on a cold November morning, with the dry, sharp smell of seasoned oak coals burning slow in the oven's inner fire-brick chamber, with the cool, clean smell of fresh Galician sourdough, starter being fed warm whole milk in a small earthen crock on the back corner of the kitchen wood stove, with the warm, amber smell of beeswax being rubbed slow into the carved beechwood handle of a long bread peel to keep the wood from splitting in the heat, and with the deep, cool, dusk smell of the coal patch backyards themselves, breathing slow out of the raspberry and coal rock hollows on a warm August evening, smoky and old and full of years. She had grown up sitting on a low cedar stool beside her babka's outdoor oven in the coal patch backyard when she was 3 and 4 years old, watching her babka's long red-knuckled hands draw a long wooden bread peel slow out of a hot brick hearth, lifting a deep golden-brown loaf of rye and buckwheat bread out of the oven, with a slow patience that did not look like work but like listening. Her babka was Jadwiga Kowalski, born in 1940 in the same small coal miner's row house at the back end of Kowalski Row where Helena would later be born, the only daughter of Wojciech and Helena Kowalski. She had learned the oven and the starter at the side of her own mother on the same brick-and-clay outdoor bake oven and the same carved beechwood bread peel her great-grandmother had carried out of Galicia in 1898. Jadwiga was small and quick, with the long, red-knuckled hands of a coal-patch oven woman, her white hair worn under a faded blue cotton kerchief tied at the nape of her neck. Helena had called her Babka from the first day she could shape the sound. Helena's mother, Stefania, had gone to Philadelphia when Helena was 3 and had not come back, and Helena's father, Tadeusz, had been killed in a mine collapse outside Centralia when she was 9. So the years had belonged to Babka from the time Helena could carry a wooden dough trough without spilling. She learned to tell a rye flour from a buckwheat flour by the smell of the bran before she could read. By 8, she could draw a wooden bread peel into a hot brick hearth in a single slow, even pass without breaking a single loaf's crust. By 12, she could read an oven. She could stand at her babka's elbow at the open brick mouth and see, before her babka told her, whether the oven had 2 more loaves of heat or 4, whether the inner firebrick chamber was holding at the steady 550 degrees the chamber had always held, or whether the autumn cold had drifted in through the cracked clay flue and the next bake would have to be moved to the lower shelf, whether the small living Galician starter in the small earthen crock on the back kitchen stove was running true to the family line, or whether the cold of the patch row had thinned the culture, and the starter needed a fresh feeding of warm whole milk before the next bread. By 18, she had fired her own oven for 4 full bread seasons, sealed 61 small glass jars of saved Galician sourdough starter, and dried heritage rye and buckwheat grain seed under the brick vault in her own hand, and learned every one of the 17 Galician line bread signs. Babka said a Kowalski woman had to know before she was allowed to seal a jar of her own, under her own initials. Babka, on a warm Saturday morning in October in Helena's 18th year, walked out of the small coal miner's row house with a single small loaf of freshly baked dark rye and buckwheat babka cake wrapped in clean linen and laid it in Helena's hands at the kitchen step, and said, "You are a Kowalski woman now, child. The grain knows you. The peel knows you. The oven knows you." And then she said, in her quiet way, "And there is one thing your babka has not yet shown you, because the oven herself had to choose the morning. Come up to the brick vault with me." But before Helena or Jadwiga, there had been Mariana. Mariana Kowalski had come down off a steamer at the port of New York in the autumn of 1898, 22 years old, with her young husband Piotr Kowalski, a small wooden trunk holding everything they owned, and a single oilcloth-wrapped bundle holding the carved beechwood bread peel her grandmother had handed her at the dock in Gdansk. A small earthen crock of dried Galician sourdough starter culture her own mother had been feeding warm whole milk every other day since 1841. A small leather pouch of saved Carpathian rye and buckwheat grain seed from her own father's small Galician hill farm, and the rough plans for a brick and clay coal patch outdoor bake oven her grandmother had drawn out on a piece of brown butcher paper. The Kowalskis had ridden the rails west from New York to the Pennsylvania anthracite coal patch in the spring of 1899, and they had stopped at a low backyard slope behind a small coal miner's row house on the back end of Kowalski Row, because the slope of the backyard ran clean and steep the way the small mountain slopes of Galicia had run, and the coal patch dirt was deep and loamy and warm beneath the surface the way the high Galician dirt had been warm, and Mariana had stood at the foot of the backyard slope on a warm April afternoon, and she had said to Piotr in the slow, careful English she was still learning, "This is the place. The oven belongs here. We will not go further." She had been 22, she had no money to speak of, and no flock yet broken, and no one in the coal patch country who believed a young Galician immigrant woman could build a working brick and clay outdoor bake oven into a coal patch slope with her own 2 hands. But Mariana had set her hand on a fresh red brick, and she had begun. She and Piotr built the oven through the spring and summer of 1899, hand-shaping the curved fire brick of the inner chamber, fitting the squared red brick of the outer crown, hand-laying the clay flue, packing the back wall of the oven with 8 inches of dry coal patch dirt and clay insulation, and building behind the inner fire brick chamber a small hand-built brick vault with a single removable fire brick lid, hidden behind the rear wall of the oven's inner chamber. Mariana baked her first loaf of dark Galician rye and buckwheat bread on the oven hearth in October of 1899. She kept the oven for 53 years. She trained her granddaughter Helena at her side, and Helena trained her daughter Jadwiga, and the bake oven at Kowalski Hollow held its hearth and its peel and its women without a single empty autumn for 63 years, through Mariana and Helena and Jadwiga, until the autumn of 1962, when Jadwiga was 22 and her own mother Helena had just gone, and Jadwiga banked the last fire in the oven on a cool October evening and walked back down to the small frame house in Pottsville, and did not fire the oven again for 63 years. Babka had 3 rules for the oven. The first was this: the fire is the teacher. You do not bake the bread, child. The deep heat of the inner firebrick chamber and the slow, even draw of the clay flue and the long, slow rest of the dough under the linen towel through the cool patch night bake the bread, and you only stand at the open brick mouth with the peel and the dough trough in your hands, and you read what the fire's telling you, and you do what it is asking. A breadwoman who thinks she decides what the oven will give her is a breadwoman who will burn 1 loaf in 3 and pull the next one out half set, because the fire will turn against her by the 3rd bake. The second was this: the oven is the keeper. The squared red brick crown and the curved fire brick of the inner chamber and the 8 inches of dry coal patch dirt and clay insulation packed against the back wall and the hand-laid clay flue and the small brick vault hidden behind the rear wall of the inner chamber and the small kitchen wood stove with the small earthen crock of starter on the back corner are not a kitchen oven. They are a hearth and a workshop and a sleeping place for grain and a saving place for the family line, all in one outdoor brick building set into the slope of the patch backyard. A breadwoman who thinks she bakes the family bread in an electric oven is a breadwoman who is fooling herself. The oven is the keeper. The third was this: the grain is the family. The small dried Galician sourdough starter and the small saved heritage rye and buckwheat grain seed your great-great-grandmother carried out of Galicia in 1898 have been kept in small glass jars in the small brick vault behind the inner chamber of this oven for 127 years, never once gone soft, never once gone foul, never once allowed to dry out in a careless summer. We refresh the starter with warm whole milk 3 times a week. We reseal each grain jar with a hand-pressed beeswax and cotton cloth lid. We never lift the jars from the cool brick dark of the vault unless the next Kowalski woman is at the kitchen table learning to feed the starter in her own hand. And when a Kowalski woman is gone, the next Kowalski woman lifts the fire brick lid the same October morning, refreshes the starter in the same small earthen crock, and reseals the grain jars in her own hand. Mind the grain above the other 2, daughter. The oven can be repointed. The peel can be rubbed with beeswax. The hearth can be replaced. The starter and the heritage grain seed cannot be replaced. Babka died in November of 2023 on a cold, rainy afternoon in her chair beside the small wood stove in the small frame house in Pottsville, with the open-thumbed hearth book in her lap and a small earthen crock of warm Galician starter on the side table beside her. The doctor said it was her heart. Helena was 21. She did not cry. She came home from her shift at the bakery and found Babka in the chair, and she sat down on the floor beside the chair and laid her cheek against Babka's cool hand, and she stayed there until the funeral home came. She fed the starter herself that night with a small ladle of warm whole milk in her own careful young hand, and only when the crock was set back on the cool corner of the kitchen wood stove did she sit down beside the cold wood stove and finally let herself cry. The small frame house in Pottsville belonged to the county because Babka had taken a small reverse mortgage on it during her last sickness, and within 5 months of Babka's funeral, the county had come and asked Helena to be out by the 1st of October. She had left with the small carved beechwood bread peel Babka had pressed into her hand on her last clear afternoon, the single-thumbed page torn carefully from Babka's hearth book, sewn into the lining of her wool coat pocket, the small earthen crock of warm Galician starter wrapped in 2 clean dish towels and a wool sweater, a small canvas bag of her clothes, and the photograph of 3 women standing at the brick mouth of the oven in 1948. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a small living thing in your family that someone kept warm and fed for years on end? A starter, a sourdough, a tended fire that you carry with you from a woman who is no longer here. The half-mile walk up Kowalski Row from the foot of the coal patch village to the abandoned coal miners' row house at the back end was longer than she remembered, because the wide coal patch country opened slow and red around her as she walked, and the late afternoon light came down soft and warm across the open backyards. The wild raspberry canes were flaming deep crimson along the rusted backyard fences. A pair of coal-stained low hills rose dark behind the village. A small, clear branch came down off the back ridge, clean and cool, over rounded fieldstones along the right of the row. She found the foundation of the small coal miners' row house first, 4 courses of fieldstone and dark brick in a square of new wild raspberry overgrowth, and beyond the foundation, set into the steep slope of the backyard at the back end of the row, under the open arc of an anthracite country sky, the small brick and clay outdoor bake oven. 6 feet wide, 5 feet tall at the brick crown, hand-shaped squared red brick of the outer crown, silvered and split at the second course by 63 winters of frost, hand-laid clay flue, silvered and slumped at the rear, a small arched brick mouth at the front facing the row, a hand-built oak ash door warped on hand-forged iron strap hinges, rusted dark, 63 autumns of fallen wild raspberry leaves and dry coal patch dust banked deep against the brick step at the mouth, the steep coal patch slope of the backyard rising up behind the oven to the back ridge. She did not cry. She brushed the dry raspberry leaves and the coal patch dust from the brick step with her boot, fitted the heavy iron key into the small hand-forged iron lock plate set into the oak ash door at hip height, worked the key gently for the better part of 2 minutes until the wards remembered how to turn, and then the bolt slid back with a small dry sound, and the oak ash door eased open on its iron hinges with the slow groan of a door that is held shut for 63 winters. The cool, dry breath of the oven came out to meet her, the dim, warm, brick-and-grain smell of old oak ash and old beeswax and the faint, warm, sweet ghost of 127 years of dark rye and buckwheat bread. She stood at the open brick mouth a long minute. Then she lit her babka's small brass kerosene lantern, and she ducked through the brick mouth into the inner chamber. The inner fire brick chamber was 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide and tall enough to crouch, the curved fire brick walls cool and dry. The inner chamber's small ash floor swept clean by Babka in 1962. A small wooden ash shovel still leaned in the back corner where Babka had set it down. A small length of clean linen still hung from a hand-forged iron hook on the inner wall where the last loaf had been wrapped to cool. And in the dim, warm air of the inner chamber, low at first and then growing in her ears as her ear settled, was the soft, cool brick-and-grain smell of 3 generations of saved Galician starter and heritage grain sealed in the small brick vault behind the rear wall of the chamber she was crouching in. She knelt slowly on the cool ashen brick floor of the inner chamber. She remembered very clearly a thing Babka had said one summer afternoon over coffee at the kitchen table in Pottsville when Helena was 16. The good Kowalski ovens, child. We keep what is dearest sealed in a hand-built cypress chest in a small brick vault behind the rear wall of the inner fire brick chamber, hidden by a single removable fire brick lid set flush in the back wall. Because the dry brick warmth of the vault holds glass against damp and frost better than any cellar in any farmhouse, and no thief who has never drawn a wooden bread peel out of a hot brick hearth at first light. In a cold patch, Dawn would think to lift the rear fire brick of an outdoor bake oven and look for what a Kowalski woman has set down there. Helena lifted the single removable fire brick lid, set flush in the rear wall of the inner chamber, the one Babka had loosened on her own hand a long time before. Beneath the fire brick, set into the small hand-built brick vault behind the chamber, sealed in a long, dark oilcloth bundle tied with weathered hemp twine, lay the cypress chest. She lifted it out carefully through the small brick opening. It was heavier than she had expected. She set the chest on the cool brick step in front of the open oven mouth and untied the hemp twine of the oilcloth, slow with her fingers. And she opened the oilcloth fold by fold, and inside, the hand-built cypress chest, the lid carved on its top with 3 small joined letter Ks. She lifted the lid, and inside, packed in a thin bed of dry coal patch sand and dry oak shavings, lay the jars, 67 of them, Small clean glass jars sealed with hand-pressed beeswax and cotton cloth lids tied with linen string, some holding small careful suspensions of dried Galician sourdough starter culture, some holding small careful suspensions of saved Carpathian rye and buckwheat grain seed, each jar with a small slip of waxed paper tied to it with linen string carrying the year and the line and the woman's full name. Mariana, Galician starter, 1899, first jar. Mariana, Carpathian rye seed, 1901. Mariana, Carpathian buckwheat seed, 1904. Mariana, Galician starter refresh, 1912. Mariana, Carpathian rye seed, 1921. Helena, Galician starter, 1931, first jar under her own initials. Helena, Carpathian rye seed, 1938. Helena, Carpathian buckwheat seed, 1946. Jadwiga, Galician starter, 1958, first jar under her own initials. Jadwiga, Carpathian rye seed, 1962. The last jar Babka had sealed in the vault before she had banked the last fire for 63 winters. The slow Galician-line bread-keeping of 3 generations of women, sealed in glass and dry oak in a small brick vault behind the inner chamber of a Pennsylvania coal-patch bake-oven for 6 decades. Beneath the jars, in the cool brick dark of the chest, lay a small flat tin box with a hinged lid and a small leather pouch. Helena lifted the tin. Inside was the original hearth book, thick, sewn together with linen thread, the cover of soft-tanned oilskin, the pages of cotton paper hand-cut and hand-ruled, and on every page, in the careful old hands of 3 generations of Kowalski women, was the whole record of the oven, the fire build, the chamber temperature, the flour grind, the starter feed, the dough rise, the peel pass, the loaf weight, the bake time, the cool wrap, page after page after page, 127 years of careful Galician-line coal-patch oven-keeping. Inside the small leather pouch lay 17 small American gold coins, $5 pieces from the 1870s and 80s, the gold Mariana had carried out of Galicia in the lining of her coat, and folded into the back of the hearth book, sealed with a drop of warm dark beeswax gone hard as amber, was a single letter, the wax still whole, addressed in long, careful, old Polish-tinged penmanship, to the granddaughter who lifts the fire brick. From Mariana Kowalski, Piekarka, Kowalski Hollow, 1900. She broke the wax seal with her thumb and read the letter aloud to the open oven mouth because there was no one else to read it to, and the slow, dim jars were the only thing listening. To the granddaughter who lifts the fire brick. If you are reading this, you have walked up Kowalski Row with a key in your hand, and you have brushed the leaves from the step, and you have turned the bolt, and you have lit a lantern in the dim, and you have known to kneel inside the inner fire brick chamber and lift the single rear fire brick lid, set flush in the back wall, and you are a Kowalski woman, and the oven has called you home. My name is Mariana Kowalski. I was born Mariana Nowak on a small mountain farm in eastern Galicia in the autumn of 1876, the eldest of 4 daughters, and the only one my mother taught the oven and the peel and the saved starter, because I was the only one who would sit still long enough to learn to listen to the grain. I came across the ocean with my husband Piotr in the autumn of 1898, with a small oilcloth bundle of the bread peel and the starter and the saved Carpathian rye and buckwheat seed and the rough plans my grandmother had drawn out on a piece of brown butcher paper, and I came down off the steamer at the port of New York, and we rode the rails west to this Pennsylvania anthracite coal patch in the spring of 1899, and I stood at the foot of this backyard slope on a warm April afternoon, and I knew, the way a woman knows a thing once and keeps it for 50 years, that the oven was here. I built this oven with my own 2 hands and Piotr's across the spring and summer of 1899, and I baked my first loaf of dark Galician rye and buckwheat bread on the hearth in October, and I sealed my first jar of starter and saved Carpathian seed in the small brick vault behind the rear wall in November. The jars in the cypress chest below this letter, daughter, are not money. They are not gold. They are the family. The oven can be repointed. The peel can be rubbed with beeswax. The flue can be relaid. The dough can be remade. The starter and the heritage grain, fed once with warm milk and sealed once in glass, are the family kept in brick and oak and the slow patch dark. The gold in the pouch is the small gold I carried out of Galicia, and I trust you will not spend it for any reason other than to mend this brick crown or replace this clay flue or buy fresh whole rye from a Mahanoy city mill. In a year, your own grain runs thin. Do not move the jars. Do not unseal the wax lids unless you mean to plant the seed in a clean field. Do not be greedy with the jars in the chest. Lift one jar to the grain researcher who comes asking after pre-war Carpathian heritage bloodlines, and lay the rest of the jars in the cypress chest the way you found them, and close the oak ash door at sundown the way a Kowalski woman has closed the door of this oven at sundown for 63 years. With my whole hand and my whole heart, Mariana Kowalski, Piekarka, Kowalski Hollow, Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, the 14th of October, 1900. Helena laid the letter flat on the cool brick step. She set her open palm across it. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cool brick and grain smell of the open oven and the faint, warm, sweet ghost of 127 years of saved Galician starter and Carpathian heritage grain, and the tight thing that had lived in her chest since the cold November afternoon she had walked into Babka's kitchen loosened. The name of the loosening was home. She drove the gold pieces down to a careful coin dealer in Reading the following week, a man named Mr. André Lasoki, who valued the 17 small $5 gold pieces at $38,400. She sold 5 of them. She put $11,000 in a savings account at the Schuylkill County Bank, and she walked back up Kowalski Row with a fresh load of squared red brick for the cracked crown, 2 coils of new hemp twine, a small bag of fresh hand-ground rye flour from a Mahanoy city mill, a fresh cake of beeswax, and a small can of new kerosene for Babka's lantern. She did not move the jars. The jars stayed where Mariana and Helena and Jadwiga had sealed them, in the cool brick dark of the chest in the small brick vault behind the rear wall. But she did, that first November, walk down off the brick step with a single small loaf of fresh dark rye and buckwheat babka bread, wrapped in clean linen to the older women of Kowalski Hollow and Mahanoy City. Mrs. Agnieszka Lasotka, 87, who had been a girl when Mariana baked her last loaf, Mrs. Jadwiga Wojcik, 83, whose grandmother had been Mariana's first bread customer. Each one took the small warm loaf in their old hands and looked at it for a long time. Each one said the same thing in some form. We had begun to wonder if any of you would come back, and in the early spring, an older woman drove up the row from the Land Institute Heritage Grain Research Project, who had been searching for 30 years for surviving pre-war Carpathian rye and buckwheat genetics presumed extinct. And she stood in the open brick mouth of the oven on a warm March afternoon, with her hand against her mouth, looking at the rows of small glass jars of saved Carpathian seed under the lantern amber, and she said only, "Please, hon, please let me come back with the lab." That is the thing about the bread-keeping our grandmothers teach us, the slow kind, the kind we learn at a hot brick hearth with a long carved beechwood peel when we are 3 years old. It is not really about the loaf. The loaf is the wage. The starter is the trade. The trade is the small jars sealed in dry oak shavings in a small brick vault behind the inner chamber of a Pennsylvania coal patch outdoor bake oven for 127 years, and the slow, even draw of a clay flue at first light in a cold October dawn, and the small earthen crock of warm starter set on the cool corner of a kitchen wood stove and fed warm milk by a Kowalski hand every other day for 127 years. The trade is, above all, the truth, Mariana wrote in her letter on the 14th of October, 1900. The starter is the family. The oven is the keeper. The fire is the teacher. We are only the next pair of hands. Helena Kowalski was 22 years old and penniless. She had $4 to her name, and she spent them on a small brick and clay outdoor bake oven built into the slope of the backyard of an abandoned coal miner's row house at the back end of Kowalski Row in Kowalski Hollow in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. It was the best $4 she ever spent. If this story has kept you company tonight, thank you for sitting up with us. Sleep well, breathe easy, and see you in the last warm light of the day.